What is up, you guys? Your boy Elafa is back with another video. It is Saturday morning and the playoffs officially begin at 2:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Before it starts, however, I thought I'd present to you guys with this video showing you my predictions based off what I think will occur within the NBA playoffs. Before we begin today's video, however, consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. I post NBA controversial discussion videos or even relatable discussion videos that you may enjoy if you are a die-hard NBA fan. And you guys also have the option to comment down below any future video topics that you may want to see in future videos. But other than that, let us begin today's video. Now, before we start, if you observe this playoff bracket thoroughly, you may see that the Warriors are within the 8th seed instead of the Memphis Grizzlies. Keep in mind that this video was created yesterday before the play-in game began between the Warriors and Grizzlies, and I thought the Warriors were going to win the game, but instead the Grizzlies did. But long story short, if the Grizzlies go up against the Jazz, I would take the Jazz to win that series in either 5 or 6 games. Now, let us begin. Okay, so here we have all 16 teams within the NBA playoffs, and then we have 8 teams in the Western Conference, of course, and then 8 teams in the Eastern Conference. So, to start things off, we're going to start off with the matchup between the Utah Jazz and the Golden State Warriors. Not going to make things too long. The Jazz are going to take this series by probably 6 games. I could see it going 7 games because you guys know the narrative between the Utah Jazz not being necessarily a great #1 seed, but at the end of the day, the Golden State Warriors are relying on one player and one player only regarding Stephen Curry and his team. Outside of him, I simply don't trust them enough to get them over the hump to beat the Utah Jazz in a 7-game series. So that's exactly why I have the Jazz beating the Golden State Warriors in the first round. So second, we have the Los Angeles Clippers and the Dallas Mavericks. To me, this matchup is very interesting, of course, since these guys played each other in the playoffs last season, and it was very outstanding and very entertaining, and it seems like these two teams were playing more of a personal basketball type of style last season. Looking at the way they played, Luka Doncic hitting buzzer beaters and Montrezl Harrell and Marcus Morris being hostile. But ultimately this season, I have the Clippers beating the Dallas Mavericks in the first round yet again, just like last season. Luka Doncic and the Mavericks, they're a very good team, but I don't think they're going to be enough to beat Kawhi Leonard and Paul George and the Los Angeles Clippers as a whole. So next, we have the Denver Nuggets and the Portland Trail Blazers. Nikola Jokic is playing like he's gonna win the MVP this season, and you already know Dame Time, Dame Dollar, and CJ McCollum has been bowling for the Portland Trail Blazers. Now, you guys may be surprised regarding who I picked to win this series, but I'm actually gonna go with the Portland Trail Blazers winning this series in most likely 7 games. Now, this may be surprising to you guys because the Nuggets are a really great team, and you guys will probably pick the Nuggets to beat the Blazers rather than the Blazers beating the Nuggets within this series. But I feel like it's gonna all boil down to the fact that the Nuggets are suffering a severe loss of scoring and star power regarding losing Jamal Murray for the rest of the entire season, and I feel like that loss is really gonna haunt them in the playoffs regarding this specific series. And I feel like if Jamal Murray was playing in this series, they would definitely win this series, not in an easy shot, but it'll most likely take the Nuggets 6 or 7 games to beat the Blazers if Jamal Murray was still on the floor. But despite Jamal Murray not being on the floor for the Denver Nuggets, this team was still playing respectable basketball, which is amazing. But when it comes to the playoffs, it's a completely different ball game, and losing Jamal Murray for the rest of this entire season is definitely going to haunt them regarding this specific series. And considering how much Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum can score, the Denver Nuggets are going to have to nullify their scoring by scoring back in a higher frequency, and Jamal Murray gives the Denver Nuggets an extra oomph of scoring, and he's not even there to provide the Denver Nuggets with that scoring that they're gonna need desperately. So despite every single thing that I said, the Portland Trail Blazers is gonna definitely take this series most likely in 7 games. And last but not least, within the first round of the Western Conference, we have the Phoenix Suns and the Los Angeles Lakers, and this is gonna be easily the Los Angeles Lakers. The Phoenix Suns, just like I said about the Utah Jazz, there's gonna be a narrative revolving around them not being a great 2 seed, and the Lakers are not even a real 7 seed despite them falling all the way down to the 7 7th seed in the first place due to injuries, and you could argue the fact that if the team never got injured, they'll probably be the 1st seed. And despite that narrative in the first place, the Lakers are gonna definitely beat the Phoenix Suns. Not in 5 games, it's probably gonna be in 6 games, but at the end of the day, the Suns are going home in the first round to the Los Angeles Lakers, which is very unfortunate. So now let us get into the second round matchups between the Utah Jazz, the Los Angeles Clippers, and then the Portland Trail Blazers and the Los Angeles Lakers. To start things off, we have the Clippers and the Jazz, and despite the Jazz being a very great team, they locked up the #1 seed for an extraordinary amount of time, but the LA Clippers are gonna come out this series in most likely 5 or 6 games. I simply don't trust the Jazz enough to be able to beat a great team like the Clippers that has Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. And the one thing that I did realize about the Utah Jazz is the fact that they don't really have any type of player that can close out games outside of Donovan Mitchell, and those closeout games, those late crunch time games, are going to be very important when you're going up against a great team like the Los Angeles Clippers. And I simply think if the Los Angeles Clippers game plans to simply focus on Donovan Mitchell, making him not be able to score within crunch time moments, there's not going to be any other player within the Utah Jazz that can be a prolific scorer to win them that specific game. And I simply feel like the Los Angeles Clippers has more of a complete team built for the playoffs rather than the Utah Jazz within that standpoint. So I feel like the Los Angeles Clippers are going to be beating the Utah Jazz within the second round in most likely 6 games. And now we have the Portland Trail Blazers and the Los Angeles Lakers matching up against one another within the second round of the NBA playoffs. The last postseason occurred and the Los Angeles Lakers beat the Portland Trail Blazers in 5 games within the first round. And I simply think the Los Angeles Lakers are going to yet again beat the Portland Trail Blazers in this year's postseason in the second round, but this time not in 5 games but in 6 games. Like I've already mentioned, and I'm going to mention it once again, the Los Angeles Lakers are not a real 7 seed. If they would have stayed healthy for the entire season, they would probably be sitting at the #1 or 2 seed. But branching away from that specific narrative momentarily, I really think the Portland Trail Blazers don't match up well against the Los Angeles Lakers at all. The Portland Trail Blazers are going to have to worry about 2 great and huge defensive centers in Anthony Davis and Andre Drummond, and then you have Montrezl Harrell coming off the bench bringing huge intensity and hustle factors for the Los Angeles Lakers' favor. And I'm already considering the fact that the Portland Trail Blazers do have Yusuf Nurkic and Enes Kanter, but I don't think the Blazers have enough defensive assets to at least hinder Anthony Davis or Andre Drummond or even Montrezl Harrell from having their way down low, assuming that they're one of the worst defensive teams in the league. And the great defensive ability that the Los Angeles Lakers currently possess could potentially hinder Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum from having great extraordinary games, and that could be another huge factor for the Portland Trail Blazers falling to the Los Angeles Lakers in the second round. And now, the matchup we've all been waiting for, the conference finals matchup, the Battle of LA between the Los Angeles Clippers and the Los Angeles Lakers. However, we're going to be holding off on this matchup for right now. We're going to be transitioning over to the Eastern Conference style of things momentarily. So, to start things off, the Philadelphia 76ers and the Washington Wizards, easily the Sixers in most likely 5 games. The Wizards are probably one of the worst defensive teams in the league, and they're probably not going to be able to stop Joel Embiid, who's a beast down low, and probably Ben Simmons, who's also a prolific scorer down low in the paint and can play great, very great defense, and he's a very oversized point guard, and that could potentially hinder Russell Westbrook or even Bradley Beal from having extraordinary games within that series. And next, we have the New York Knicks and the Atlanta Hawks. You could say both of these teams completely overachieved throughout this duration of this entire season, and me personally, I would definitely say that this series is a toss-up and both of these teams can advance to the second round. But me personally, I would have the New York Knicks advancing past the Atlanta Hawks in the first round in 7 games. Julius Randle is playing his best basketball of his entire career, playing like a most improved player of the year. The New York Knicks are also one of the best defensive teams in the league, and they also have a coach in Tom Thibodeau who is not going down without a fight and will push his players to ensure that the New York Knicks will come out with the win within this series. So we have a very interesting series regarding the Miami Heat and the Milwaukee Bucks going up against each other in the first round, and these two teams played against one another within last year's postseason, and we already know how it turned out. The Miami Heat came up on top in 5 games, beating the Milwaukee Bucks in dominant fashion. And it's so unfortunate that this series has to come into effect so early within the Eastern Conference playoffs. You would think that these two teams will have to go up against each other in the second round, but no, this is the first round of the playoffs. Now, we already know the Miami Heat dominated the Milwaukee Bucks last season, but this time around, the Milwaukee Bucks are going to come out on top, redeeming themselves, beating the Miami Heat in most likely 6 games. So, taking things into perspective, the Milwaukee Bucks compared to last season has improved their roster drastically, adding a great two-way player in Jrue Holiday, and indeed, Jrue Holiday is going to be a game changer within this series, and he's going to be a highly impactful player that could get the Milwaukee Bucks over the hump to potentially beat the Miami Heat in 6 games or less. And then you have to tack on the fact that the Miami Heat lost a great contributor in Jay Crowder, who was a great part within the finals run last season. And then, like I've already said, Jrue Holiday can be the deciding factor to potentially hinder Tyler Hero or Duncan Robinson from having great games within this series alone. And last but not least, within the first round of the Eastern Conference, we got the Brooklyn Nets and the Boston Celtics. I'm not going to take too long on this. It's going to be the Nets in most likely 5 for 4 games. The Boston Celtics all season has not been playing up to their potential, and now Jaylen Brown is out for the entire season. Not going to explain it too much. This should be a no-brainer regarding who should come out on top of this series, and the Nets should be able to dominate the Celtics within this series alone. So now we got the second round of the Eastern Conference, the Philadelphia 76ers against the New York Knicks, and this is, to me, this is also pretty easy. It's going to be the Philadelphia 76ers. Although I'm from New York City, I support what the Knicks are doing all season. I gotta put all bias aside. The New York Knicks are simply not ready for the big moment, and to beat a great team like the Philadelphia 76ers with great star power and great chemistry alone. So the Philadelphia 76ers are probably gonna beat the New York Knicks in either 5 or 6 games. And now we're gonna go on to the Milwaukee Bucks and the Brooklyn Nets, and this is going to be a very entertaining and impactful, thrilling series in my opinion alone. So, as you guys may know, both the Milwaukee Bucks and the Brooklyn Nets are both teams that could score in high proportions. The Brooklyn Nets are probably the best scoring team in the league, and the Milwaukee Bucks are probably not too far behind the Brooklyn Nets within that criteria. But the one thing that the Milwaukee Bucks have over the Brooklyn Nets is the fact that they could play defense very consistently, whereas on the other hand, the Brooklyn Nets is known to have very lackluster defense. So when considering this series in particular, I feel like this series is going to involve most of their games being within clutch time situations, and I feel like the winner of this series entirely is going to come down to who can perform the best within the clutch time moments. And due to that standpoint, I feel like the Nets are gonna barely grab this series in 7 games, assuming that they have multiple players regarding James Harden, Kyrie Irving, and Kevin Durant, who are all players that could come out in the clutch and bring out buckets, whereas the Bucks have players like Giannis that could potentially do it, but then they have to rely on players like Chris Middleton and Jrue Holiday and others who are not nearly as reliable as Kevin Durant, James Harden, or Kyrie Irving to bring down clutch time performing baskets down the stretch. And I feel like that circumstance is going to be able to get the Nets over the hump to win this series entirely, even though I feel like this series is a toss-up within itself. So now we got both the Western Conference Finals and the Eastern Conference Finals. Now to start off, let us start discussing the Western Conference Finals, the highly anticipated matchup, the Battle of LA between the Los Angeles Clippers and the Los Angeles Lakers. Now, this series in particular is going to be a well-fought, well-battled, highly thrilling series indeed. But at the end of the day, I genuinely feel like the Los Angeles Lakers is going to eventually come out on top between the Los Angeles Clippers and the Los Angeles Lakers matchup. Now, let us start considering circumstances that is worth mentioning. Now, it has already been brought out to the light that LeBron James may not be 100% healthy during this playoff run, as well as considering that Anthony Davis missed an exponential amount of time due to an injury of himself. But the main reason why I'm picking the Lakers to win is because I simply do not trust a player within the Los Angeles Clippers going by the name of Paul George. No intentions to slander Paul George at all, as he's a phenomenal basketball player and a reliable star for the Clippers throughout this entire season. But we already know that when it comes down to the clutch and when it comes down to when it matters, Paul George just always never shows up, and that really haunted every single team that he has ever been on revolving around winning basketball. If Paul George manages to show up and play the way that he's supposed to play as the second option all-star for the Los Angeles Clippers, then maybe we could be possibly looking at a completely different scenario. But as of right now, I simply do not trust the Los Angeles Clippers to beat the Los Angeles Lakers in a 7-game series, specifically for that one single circumstance. And now, last but not least, we have the Eastern Conference Finals matchup between the Philadelphia 76ers and the Brooklyn Nets. Now, this could be a competitive series indeed, but when it comes down to it, I feel like the Brooklyn Nets are going to be able to beat the Philadelphia 76ers in only 6 games. I honestly don't have too much to say regarding why I feel as though the Brooklyn Nets could beat the Philadelphia 76ers in 6 games. I simply feel like the Brooklyn Nets, in comparison to the Philadelphia 76ers, are more suited and more built to make the NBA Finals and be a competitive team to be able to beat the Philadelphia 76ers in the long stretch of things. Now, I may be contradicting myself when I make that statement just a little bit, assuming the fact that I did say the Milwaukee Bucks are probably the only team that has a real shot of knocking the Brooklyn Nets out of playoff contention, assuming the fact that the Nets are a better team than the Bucks on paper. But in comparison to the Philadelphia 76ers, I simply feel as though the Milwaukee Bucks match up better than the Sixers do when it comes to going up against the Brooklyn Nets in a playoff series. And now we have the NBA Finals between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Brooklyn Nets. Both are teams who are favored to make the NBA Finals, and the Los Angeles Lakers are one of the few 7-seeded teams to make the NBA Finals. Now, assuming every single circumstance, like I've already said, LeBron James and Anthony Davis have dealt with injuries for an enormous amount of time throughout this entire NBA season, and due to an injury perspective, LeBron may not be his normal self when it comes to going up against the Brooklyn Nets in the finals. This matchup for the Lakers is going to be the toughest one yet out of every single team they went up against within the Western Conference. And if the Lakers are seeking to take down the Nets, LeBron and Anthony Davis are going to have to be playing at 100% capacity. Due to the injury circumstance, I feel like the Nets will dethrone the defending champions in the Los Angeles Lakers to win their first NBA Finals in franchise history. It will definitely be competitive basketball indeed between these two teams, but in most likely 6 or 7 games, the Nets will overcome LeBron James and the Lakers. It sucks to have lingering injuries determine a playoff series, but at the end of the day, injuries are part of the basketball game, and we have seen this circumstance time after time. But other than that, that will conclude today's video. What do you guys think about my predictions? I already know this video may be very controversial, and some of you guys may be ready to rip my head off literally based off what I predicted, but we need some controversy within the NBA world, as it makes things 100 times more interesting. Playoff basketball sets upon us within a couple more hours, and let us now enjoy the iconic events that could possibly unfold within this year's postseason. Make sure you guys like this video and subscribe to the channel. I will greatly appreciate it. I'm out. Peace.